everybody. Welcome back. So I asked you to read two essays for today, both of which are key documents in developing and explaining a branch of theory called structuralism that also comes out of linguistics, but takes it in a rather different direction. So the essays you were to read for today are Claude Lévi-Strauss's The Structural Study of Myth and Jonathan Culler's The Linguistic Foundation. All right, so structuralism. Oh, this isn't doing the thing. You're not going to advance when I press the button? All right. All right, so structuralism originates in a field of study called semiotics that is invented by or originated by a guy by the name of Charles Sanders Peirce in the late 19th century. And yes, this is Peirce with his fabulous Victorian beard. The 19th century really is the golden age of eccentric facial hair. So Peirce is an American mathematician, scientist, and logician. And semiotics was the name he gave to what he referred to as the study of signs. So what is a sign? Well, a sign for Peirce was any combination of a signifier and a signified, right? So the signified being the concept that is indicated by the sign. The signifier being whatever symbol, image, what have you, we use to represent that concept, right? So there are three general types of signs that a semiotician studies. The first are what are called iconic signs. This is where the signifier resembles the signified, right? So think like, say, hieroglyphics are iconic, right? Or pictograms are iconic, right? We're using a picture of the signified as the signifier. There are also what are called indexical signs, in which case the signifier is a reliable indicator of the signified. So for example, when you see smoke, right? Smoke is an index of fire, right? It indicates that there is probably a fire occurring beneath the smoke. And the final and really most common type is the symbol. And in a symbol relationship, right, the signifier's relationship to the signified is based entirely on use and convention. And most language, most written or spoken language, falls into this category, right? There's no particular reason why speakers of the English language should use the symbols CAT to refer to a small furry creature with 4 feet and a tail that likes milk and fish and is often strangely aloof yet cherished by human beings. The reason we use those letters to represent this creature is just purely one of convention, right? There's no actual logical relationship between the symbol and the thing the symbol signifies. So, structuralism itself begins as a philosophy of language that grows out of Peirce's work on signs. It's developed in continental Europe, primarily from the 1940s to the 1960s, at least as a way of reading texts. But the linguist who really kind of comes up with this system is a guy by the name of Ferdinand de Saussure, here illustrated, with a fabulous mustache. So Saussure's course in general linguistics is published in 1916. Now you'll notice this is a posthumous publication, right? So as Saussure is developing all of these theories, he's teaching them to his students at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. And after his death, as a tribute to him, his students collect up material from his lectures and have it published as a book. So the primary argument of Saussure's book is that languages are symbolic systems in which meaning is determined by differences between signs in the system. Right? So what matters are the ways in which all of the signs in the system differ from each other and have the relationships between them, right? The types of relationships that occur between signs. All right, so these are some of Saussure's key concepts, right? He comes up with three major distinctions that structure his study of language. First is the distinction between what he calls langue and parole. So these are both French words meaning language, right? But langue, for Saussure, refers to language as a system, whereas parole refers to individual speech acts or pieces of writing, right? Individual utterances. So we can never actually see the whole system of langue operating at a time, right? We can only learn langue, we can learn the system, we can discern the system by observing instances of parole and relationships between them. So an analogy that is frequently used to explain this relationship is that langue is the game of chess, right? The rules, all the possible moves, the relationships between the pieces and the players, everything that makes up the whole system of the game of chess. An individual game of chess is an example of parole, right? It's putting that system, putting those rules into use, right? And we learn the system by seeing it in use. The second major distinction is synchronic versus diachronic study of language. So synchronic language refers to the study of langue at a particular moment in time, right? So you're studying, say, the way people speak French right now, or the way people spoke French in the 15th century, right? You're choosing a particular moment in the development of the language, and you're looking at the way language is used at that time, right? Whereas diachronic study of language refers to langue as it changes over time, right? So if you're doing a historical study of changes within a language, so say like you're comparing Shakespeare's English to Chaucer's English, right? That would be diachronic. Now the third major distinction that Saussure makes is between what he calls paradigmata and syntagmata. So paradigmata are relationships within categories, while syntagmata are relationships between objects in different categories. So, categories could be as broad as nouns and verbs, right? They could be as specific as animal words or activity words, right? But if you're looking at relationships within a single category, you're looking at paradigmata. If you're looking at relationships between objects in different categories, that's syntagmata. This isn't really going to factor too much into our discussion of structuralism today. I think we're going to be more concerned with the langue and parole distinction and the synchronic versus diachronic distinction. Now, languages are made up, for Saussure, of what he calls emes. And emes are the basic units of meaning in a language system. So phoneme is a basic unit of sound, right? And we can see even within the word phoneme, there are several different phonemes. F, O, N, E, M, right? Those are all separate phonemes, separate units that carry meaning. A morpheme is a unit of grammar. So the study of grammar in a system is referred to as morphology, right? And a morpheme is the single unit that is studied in morphology. Now, we can also talk about mythemes. Now, Saussure doesn't, but his followers do actually talk about narrative in terms of mythemes, right? And mythemes are these kind of mini stories or mini events or episodes that are the building blocks of longer narratives. So, for example, we have here from Greek mythology, Odysseus making his sacrifice to raise up and speak to ghosts in Hades. Right now, this whole kind of like contact with the dead mytheme is something that occurs across many different stories. Right, so this seems to be one of those basic building blocks of narrative. All right, so as a mode of criticism, how does structuralism work? So first, it should be noted that structuralist critics are less interested in interpreting individual texts than they are in trying to figure out some grammar that underlies all literary production. So what they're looking at is like each text, each poem, each play, each film, each novel, short story, whatever, right, is part of the long that they're studying. Right? It's a single parole in the long that the structuralist critic studies. And so there's kind of a key to all mythologies aspect of this, right, where what they're looking for is that system underneath all literature. And we get to that by closely examining and picking apart individual stories, poems, plays, and what have you, in part to see like what pieces they share and what pieces they have in common, right? To build a kind of common language. So yeah, this is a long versus parole kind of distinction. Now another thing, one of the reasons I have this image up here is another thing that structuralist critics are often focused on is what they call binary oppositions, right? And binary oppositions are these pairs of opposites that are defined by one another, right? You can't understand one without reference to the other. So things like male, female, light, dark, hot, cold, wet, dry, right? These are all kind of basic binary oppositions around which mythic narratives and indeed even like contemporary narratives are all organized. All right, so some key structuralist terms, apart from binary opposition. Right? Remember binary opposition, because that will likely show up on a test. So you may have noticed that the new critics and the Russian formalists typically talked about works, right? Literary works. That was what they were concerned. That was the way they thought of literature, right? The way they thought of the material they were working on. The structuralist doesn't refer to works. The structuralist instead refers to a text. And for a structuralist, a text, which by the way can be anything, right? As we'll see in a moment when we talk about Levi Strauss. A text is a mode of writing or expression that's created by the interplay of conventions and codes that mean only in relation to each other. And the text is organized by a subject, right? There's no author. We talked last time about the death of the author when we discussed Wimsatt and Beardsley and the intentional fallacy. The structuralists take this a little bit further, right? Wimsatt and Beardsley just say that the author's opinions don't matter. Structuralists basically kind of deny the existence of an author. Now, you don't create. What you do is organize codes and conventions that you, as a subject, have experienced in your life into some kind of narrative, right? Into a text. That is then made sense of through the process of reading, right? So, for a structuralist, reading is the way you activate the codes, conventions, and expectations that the subject has arranged into a text, right? It just sits dormant, waiting to be discovered, right? Waiting to be activated until a reader shows up and starts putting all of these pieces together, right? So this is how a structuralist envisions the acts of literary creation and reception, right? Confused yet? I bet. So this is a list of some of the key texts in the history of structuralism. You'll notice that Vladimir Prop's Morphology of the Folktale is really early, really kind of before structuralist criticism is a thing, right? I dated the beginning of structuralist criticism in the 1940s, and Prop publishes his book in 1928. This is because kind of the way the Russian formalists and the new critics were really kind of onto similar things in different places at different times. Prop is basically doing structuralism without knowledge of Saussure and before anyone else is really doing this kind of criticism. So what he's doing is he's taking a look at Russian folk tales and fairy tales, pulling apart the units that they have in common and creating a kind of grammar of them. The key early texts in structuralist criticism are written by Claude Lévi-Strauss. So the elementary structures of kinship and structural anthropology are where a lot of the concepts we're going to talk about come from. There's A.J. Gramas's book, Structural Semantics, an attempt at a method. Stefan Todorov's The Fantastic, and Jonathan Culler's Structuralist Poetics. And you'll notice most of these writers are European. Gramas is Lithuanian French, Todorov is Russian French. But yeah, structuralism was really big in France in particular. It's always been more popular in Europe than in Britain and the US. Jonathan Culler is kind of its primary US exponent. But some of the successors to structuralism proved to be more popular in the Anglo-American world than structuralism itself was. Oh, and there's also Roland Barthes' book, Mythologies. Although Barthes will eventually become a deconstructionist, which we'll discuss when we get there. So this is Jonathan Culler as of the early 1980s, still alive, I think. As I said, he's the leading American structuralist theorist, and he argues that the aim of structuralism is to understand and formulate the basic rules underlying human culture, literary culture in particular. So for Culler, it's descriptive, not prescriptive, right? And I think this is an important thing to note, is that structuralism is really never about what should be. It's always about describing what is, right? Or at least that's what it attempts to do. So the key concept that's associated with Culler is the idea of the competent reader. So go back a slide to that reading process that we talked about. The competent reader, as Culler describes them, is a reader who has thoroughly internalized the rules and grammar of literature. So a competent reader, somebody who's familiar with all of the conventions and codes that they activate is going to have a different experience of a text than what a structuralist might call a naive reader, who is coming to the text without this kind of education or without this kind of information. So critical readings for color are typically produced by competent readers, not by naive readers. Now, Levi-Strauss was, he is no longer with us, a Belgian anthropologist. And his key insight was to apply Saussure's methods to various cultural phenomena, something you would also see if you read Roland Barthes' book, Mythologies. So the kinds of cultural phenomena Levi-Strauss examines are things like fashion, social rituals, advertising, literature, mythology, right? So everything from the highbrow to the lowbrow, to the middle brow, right? Anything that is produced by a human culture for Levi-Strauss can be examined by this method. Cultural practices for Levi-Strauss are combinations of signs that have a set significance within a culture. So, for example, a handshake as a gesture of friendship and trust, right? Within, in particular, Western European cultures. So, for Levi-Strauss, the culture at large, the whole of the culture, is long. That's the system. While individual cultural practices are examples of the whole. Okay, so how is he useful to literary critics in particular? Well, mostly for his dissection of myth. So Levi-Strauss argues that a myth in general functions like language. That myths are constructed out of mythemes, which serve specific kind of grammatical functions as building blocks of narrative. He noticed that a lot of myths are kind of broadly similar to each other. Whatever culture they come from, whatever the overarching narrative is, there's kind of the same set of elements in most of them. And that by examining patterns of inclusion and exclusion in similar myths, or related myths, we can discern what that underlying grammar is, right? What the long beneath myth is. And I say myth rather than the myth intentionally. He's talking about like basically a system for explaining all myth as a kind of language. So to tell a specific myth, we read synchronically. To compare similar myths and detect patterns, we read diachronically, right? So a synchronic reading would be a single retelling of a particular myth, right? A diachronic reading is when we look at kind of the development of like different versions of a myth throughout its history. But the origins of the myth don't matter, right? Levi-Strauss doesn't care where the myth originally comes from. All versions of the myth must be considered together. We have to do that diachronic reading in order to discern the meaning of the myth. And the basic purpose, as he sees it, of myth is to reconcile paradoxes in human belief, right? So we talked about those binary oppositions a moment ago, right? So what myth attempts to do is resolve conflict between those binary oppositions. So how does this work in practice? Well, something like this. So you'll see in the essay in your textbook a chart that basically looks like this, right? This is Levi-Strauss describing the elements of the Oedipus myth, right? And this is the elements kind of arranged diachronically. So if we retell this entire myth synchronically. Right? We start with a prince named Cadmos who is seeking his sister who has been kidnapped by the god Zeus. Cadmos is led by the gods to a place where he is told to sow a bunch of dragons. He's told to kill a dragon that lives there and sow the teeth in the ground. Once he does so, these warriors called Spartoi spring up out of the ground. Most of the Spartoi kill each other. The survivors, with Cadmos, found a city called Thebes. So Cadmos has a son, Labdacos. Labdacos has a son, Laios. And Laios has a son, Oedipus. And Laios has received an oracle that says that his son will grow up to kill him and to marry his mother. So, Laios is out, fuck no. And leaves the baby out in the wilderness to meet its fate. And just to kind of help things along, he makes sure that the baby's ankles are pierced to make it more difficult for the child to get around and crawl. Hence the name Oedipus, swollen foot. Well, the baby survives, is taken in by a kindly shepherd, and then raised by the childless king and queen of Corinth. As an adult, Oedipus goes to the oracle, who tells him that he is destined to kill his father, marry his mother. He doesn't know he's adopted, so he freaks out and says, okay, I can never go home to Corinth again. On the road, he meets an old man who is particularly rude to him, insists he gets out of the way. Oedipus says, make me. They fight, and Oedipus kills the old man, who turns out to be his biological father, Laios. He then solves a riddle to kill the monster that's been plaguing the city of Thebes, where he was born, though he doesn't know it. And as a prize, gets to marry the still young and beautiful Queen Jocasta, who he does not realize is his own mother. They have 4 children together. Twin boys, Eteocles and Polynices, and daughters, Antigone and Ismene. So once Oedipus realizes what has happened, puts out his own eyes, and wanders off into the wilderness, his sons decide they're going to split the throne between themselves. Right? Each will rule for 7 years, and then give over to the other. Eteocles goes first. At the end of his 7 years, he says, you know what, I like being king. I'm not going to give up the throne. So Polynices raises an army, attacks Thebes, and the two kill each other. As a result, Jocasta's brother Creon, being the nearest relation to the royal family still alive, becomes king and decrees that while Eteocles will be given a hero's burial since he died defending Thebes, Polynices will be left out for the dogs and vultures because he died attacking Thebes. His sister Antigone refuses to obey these prohibitions, arguing that I have duties to both of my dead brothers, and Polynices deserves a real burial. So she ignores Creon's prohibition and gives him a proper funeral, for which she is then herself entombed alive. So this is a long and involved family saga, right? That covers several generations here. But what Levi-Strauss has done is broken this down into related units, right? So here, in this column, we have story units in which a character overvalues his own family of relationship, right, to his own detriment. The second column gives us events in which, or mythemes in which, a character or characters undervalue their own family relationships. Now here we have civilization defending monster killing events. And the other unit that Levi-Strauss discerns here is a history of names that indicate some kind of lameness or physical handicap in Oedipus's line of descent. So The basic binary that Levi-Strauss sees this myth as trying to resolve, right, is to do with family relationships in the building of a civilized society, right? You know, how do we manage to live together in peace without overvaluing or undervaluing our own relations, right? Without disrespecting our families, but also without privileging them above our other connections. So yeah, this is largely kind of about the kind of handicap that comes from our inability to resolve the family's role within society, right? Okay, so that should do it for this time. So for the discussion board, what I'd like you to do is choose a specific text of any kind, right? Any kind of cultural practice you like, and try to compare it to a similar text. And maybe theorize a little bit about what this tells us about the social function of your chosen text. I'd also like to see you try Levi-Strauss's theory of mythemes on a narrative with which you are very familiar. So break it down to its parts and see what opposite or tendencies or beliefs it seems to be trying to reconcile. And finally, maybe think about what the limitations of this approach might be. For what kinds of text does it seem to work best? Are there texts on which it doesn't seem to work at all? And why might that matter? All right, so I'll see you on the forums, and our next lecture will be on Mikhail Bakhtin and his method of dialogue.